series of libraries, basically in terms of buildings. I think I'm getting some echo, but it's like talking in a swimming pool, but never mind, we'll come round. I think it's all right. I think I just began to feel it coming. And so while we were doing this study, I myself looked at about 150 libraries in about 6 months, of various types, from the British Museum down to university libraries, public libraries, small little branch libraries, and one got a certain picture of the library situation. Well, I'm going to talk to you today really about libraries as buildings. I won't be talking to you very much about university libraries, although I have been involved in the design of one university library that you will briefly see in these slides. And I have been involved in one public library which has just been opened last November, and which hasn't been photographed yet. So I'm going to take our story right the way back to when libraries all began, and I think if I can have the... I switched the lights out, I think. Well, we start with a library. It happens to be my own little branch library in London, a bit of full-fruited Edwardian architecture there in the heart of Mayfair in London. A rather nice building which was in danger of being pulled down, but the conservationists have persuaded the council that it should remain. It's a perfectly sound structure and it has a lot to be praised, and would be far worse if we had it replaced with something, most things modern. So I just start with my little local branch library, but I'm going to and of course libraries, the 500 years of libraries that I talk about are concerned with books. And I'm going to take the story right the way back to a library in Florence, which is dated 1442, and it's by an architect called Michelozzo, and it was a library in a monastery, the monastery of San Marco in Florence, and it was designed to house the collection by the Medici family. Well, the Medici family, of course, were one of the great banking merchant families that ruled Florence, and they had amassed a tremendous amount of documents, and they needed somewhere to house them, and they started in this monastery. And if you will note the arrangement, which happens to be a central aisle and what would have been documents to the right and left. Well, that's just in one sense to remind us that it's Florence, and just to remind us that I have some architects in the audience, and we go to this great dome of Florence Cathedral, and we go right up to the top. This little cupola gives you some idea of scale when you see that's as big as a parish church, and it's this little cupola which is by the very same Michelozzo that designed that library I just showed you. But the reason for going up to the top is so that one can look down, and it's the building just in front of the dome there in the church, in Brunelleschi's church of San Lorenzo, that I want to start this little story. And that building there, that long, low building running across the picture, and with the vertical pavement. And Giulio de Medici found that his collection of manuscripts needed to be housed. He decided that he was going to let selected members of the public come into this library And so he moved them from San Marco into San Lorenzo, and during the course of his the movement of these documents, he was moved up from being a merchant prince to becoming Pope Clement VII, and being a very powerful man, whether he was a Medici or a pope, he also was able to choose the best architect of the time, and so he asked Michelangelo to design this building for him. And this was 1527, and one of the interesting things about this particular library is that we do have a record of the correspondence between architect and client, the client being Pope in Vatican in Rome and Michelangelo in Florence. And it is very fascinating to see this correspondence between two great minds. Well, the Pope had wanted that building to be a very simple building outside, an unobtrusive building. And inside, you will see reflected the library at St. Marco with the central aisle and the chained manuscripts on the left. And it was a very simple arrangement. Greek documents were on one side and Roman documents were on the other. And one must remember this is 1527, and it was only about 15 years previously that the Constantinople had fallen to the Turks, and that all the Greek and Roman scholars had in the last 100 years gradually migrated westward, helping to start the Renaissance in Italy. And if we look at the end door, we find that one of the things we have is a rare book study, and that is Michelangelo's little drawing. It was a difficult site. It was a corner site at the end of the room, and so he had a triangular site, and here we have the idea that the librarian should be in the center there in that round desk, and all these rare books would be around, and they'd be quite able to supervise. And architecturally, it's a very interesting space because you have that very long library inside, and then this superb kind of staircase lobby leading up to it. And it's as a piece of architecture of the time, one of the finest pieces one could. And here, when you look at the staircase and then the space itself, I don't intend to talk about Mannerist architecture, which is a very good example of, but one of the things I might ask my non-architect friends here is, what is the wall plane? There are about, the surface there goes in, out. What is the actual plane? What is the wall? It's one of the extraordinary things about this architecture of this period, and especially Michelangelo, the whole thing of the moving surfaces. That's rather digressing from our story. 1527, 1677 in England, Sir Christopher Wren. And Sir Christopher Wren, who had been a mathematician and an astrologer before he was an architect, was asked to do a library for his college of Trinity College, Cambridge. And he took the Laurentian library idea, but he had a different site there, and it was a quadrangle, and he had to have a building which would terminate this. So he had to have a building which was arcaded, and he also wanted to get light in, and he had to store books. So I ask you to look at that, and then we go back again to the section. And we find this is the very first example of books being arranged in U-shaped bays, and he's put them there, and he's put the windows above so that the light will come in like through clear stories. I haven't got a photograph of the interior with me, so we can't look at it. And below you see how, in fact, he's tricked the thing. The little lower arches are really filled in, and it's behind those arches and below the top windows that all the books are contained. But the ideas had, in fact, travelled from Italy. It was a time when the whole idea of architecture was spread by architects writing treatises. They were then printed and then spread around Europe. And so, in fact, it was through the vehicle of the book that architectural ideas were beginning to be transmitted, and one of the ways in which the Renaissance arrived in England. Well, the other places which were great storehouses of books at that time and a little later were the great Baroque and Rococo, especially Baroque, monasteries of Europe. This one happens to be St. Gallen in Switzerland, and it's an interesting one for architects because it was there in the early Renaissance that they discovered the Roman book by Vitruvius, which really is a kind of foundation book for all architects. And it had been lost for some hundreds of years since Roman times, and was rediscovered in this monastery. It travelled back to Italy and was printed and distributed, and that, of course, is still one of the great books of architecture. And here you find this great storehouse of books, and this very beautiful piece of architecture. Well, we go forward to the 19th century. I'm bringing you forward quite fast. I'm leaving a lot out. I'm saying that the 19th century was, of course, when we started the whole idea of mass education and the need for national collections, and each country started to build its great national collections. The British Museum Library in London, I imagine the Library of Congress, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and this is in fact one of the libraries to house part of the national collection, mainly the ones connected with the university in Paris, the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève, and by an architect called Labrouste, who was one of the architects who developed cast iron and steel architecture. Sometimes we get this. Well, as a slide somehow got out of sequence there, or it doesn't matter. This is the other of the Labrouste libraries, which is the Bibliothèque Nationale, and I'm just showing you one slide of it, which shows an entirely different requirement. Here we've got millions of books have to be housed behind, and one has the need for many positions for people to read and write, and so you get these great reading rooms appearing. Fortunately, technology keeps up with it, so in fact you have very slender columns, and in fact beautiful ceiling to this, which I don't think I have a slide of. Yes, oh no, that's where we're a bit out of sequence, because we're going back to the original one. I've got Sainte-Geneviève. Trying to get back into focus. And you do have this metal architecture, very light architecture, and the great reading rooms, and the great provision of book stacks. Well, I'm jumping even further to what was the kind of the most influential library of the 20th century, and by a Finnish architect, Alvar Aalto. It was built as a result of a competition in 1927, so it's very nearly 50 years old, and it incorporates facilities which still can't be found in too many libraries today. It had its reading rooms, it had its study rooms, it had lecture rooms, it had a place for refreshment, and in fact it was very much a community facility, and little committee rooms, little seminar rooms, all are there. in this building, and I'll show you one or two the very interesting things about it. It's the space. At that time, one is still concerned very much with supervision. So you see the strategic position of the librarian on the left, and you see the very interesting way that books are arranged on this kind of pit. And so on one side you have a pit which is about the height of a door, and it provides the top surface of a writing surface round the top, and in fact gives this very spacious feeling, and it's a characteristic of an alto library, this use of a book pit. And one looks back again, and the other thing, I'm showing you some of Alto's little sketches showing how the difference between daylight, number one, and artificial light, number two, and the need to control the light coming in through the roof lights by day to produce an even one with no shadow and to avoid too much glare, and the effect of using lights in the evening to shine on the walls, as you'll see in the second drawing, producing a kind of reflected light down on in the main space. And so even in the kind of early, 1927, one found somebody who was really considering things. He also, I might add, had his walls double thickness. They were a total of 30 inches thick, so that no traffic noise could get into the building. And so it's always considered by me to be the great model of what libraries should be, and which very few have come up to since. I might add that it's now, there you see the kind of the roof lights, and this library is now in what is the Russian-occupied part of Finland, Karelia, and there seems to be some doubt as to what happened. It was certainly damaged during the war, but nobody seems to quite know whether it's been restored or whether it's just been patched up. But it would be a great pity if it was lost, because it is one of those key libraries. Well, I think it's useful to see the same architect some 40-odd years later, and this is Alvar Aalto's library in Wolfsburg in Germany. It was a limited competition, and several architects were asked to design a library for Wolfsburg. Wolfsburg, I should point out, is the home of the Volkswagen car, and is therefore, I suppose, equivalent to Detroit in America or Dagenham in England. Not Detroit, because it is a smaller town, and it was a town created by Hitler for the people's car in the 1930s, and it needed facilities, and the library was one of them. Aalto came up with the idea that it should be more than just a library. It should be a community centre, it should be a cultural centre, and so in fact it is called the Cultural Centre. And what you are looking at here is where you see on the left these kind of faceted shapes, each represent a different size lecture room, and the rooms on the right in the first floor are little seminar rooms and rooms for children to do homework. And on the ground floor there are shops which would have some useful connection with a library. There's a bookshop, I seem to remember. I can't remember what the others. I think one is an artist supply shop. And then we look at the plan. I think it's the next one, and you see on the top plan which is the first floor, the faceted spaces which we saw on the left, which are the lecture rooms, and the library itself is in the top middle of the picture there. In fact, that is showing the roof lights. We have to go down to the lower drawing to see the actual library. Now, the library, right in the heart of the drawing, you will see the control position, and you will see a variation of what he was doing at Viipuri, the earlier library there. When we look at the photograph, I think the first photograph shows the position from that desk. Oh, that's actually looking off. Let me try and get that in. let me go back a minute, because you're looking actually from the desk, you're looking right. You're not looking straight ahead into the, or looking upwards, you're looking to the right, into where the reader's advisor is, following the very good practice of separating professional and non-professional. And that is one area of the library, but the important area is this one. And here you see the same idea that Alto was using in 1927, in 1967, the idea of the dropping the floor and putting the books around and providing the shelf all the way around as a place for writing. Now, the other point I would like to stress, well, I'll stress one other little point, the attention of Alto to all the little details. He designs all his, sorry, we can't get this up. He designs all the furniture, and there is this very great attention to detail, and especially the whole environment of the library and lighting. I mean daylighting. Now, you will see the roof lights as he had in the earlier light. But look at the top left, and you will see how over the years he has virtually got to the point where he can sculpt daylight and move it where it wanted. And you'll see that he uses a technique of bringing the light that is up at the right and then bending it round so that it will fall just where he wants it. And here you see how it works. So it's brought in and brought down so that it lights all the book ends there, and is not going to produce glare. In fact, the light, as you see, is bounced round because the light is coming in directly above the books. You can just see it right in the top left, top of the picture. You can actually see the window. The light, of course, is very bright, and it's then bounced round on a surface, on a curved surface, so that it, in fact, reflects back onto the books. And there you see how you kind of delineate your library shelves with the roof lighting. Well, I just used this slide actually very briefly last night, and it is the one library that I've been connected with, and it is a university library in Bath. And unfortunately, I haven't got the drawings which I wanted to bring with me, which would have showed some of the floor plans. I didn't. If I'd known I was going to talk to university librarians, I would have brought a greater number of slides on university libraries. But the whole point about this university, this is a new university in England. It started from nothing, and it had to be built very quickly. In fact, it had to be built in 2 years. Therefore it had to be built of prefabricated parts. So everything you're looking at is in fact prefabricated. And the library is rather like a Meccano set. It had to be built in a year. And it had to be a library which was capable of holding 750,000 books. And one or two of the things that we did was to do some very serious questioning of the kind of loadings which you get in libraries. And we came to the conclusions that most engineers completely over-design libraries, as if you're going to drive steamrollers all over the place. I'm quite prepared to admit that books weigh a lot and weigh more than practically anything else. But we decided, we took the decision based on structural calculations, that we could have a much more slimmer construction than is general. And therefore they are simple columns which fit into, well, the columns themselves fit in, are steel columns fitting into an 8-inch by 8-inch space. So they're under 8 inches square, and they're spaced at 22'6" intervals, which is about the best kind of spacing to be able to move furniture and books around. And it's just on 3 floors. I'm not actually. No, that is not the library. The library is the building on the right. That is the senior common room on the left. and unfortunately I can't show you any more than that, but it's just just to show that I have in fact been involved in library design. Another library which I can show you, which is again, this is York University in England, and this I can show you just to show you one of the things to avoid in library design, in university library. The idea was a very good one, that the students would come in, and they come in on the lower floor, and they are aware of all the departments around them, and so you can look up through this great well and see the books. Somebody rather disparaging said they thought they were on the Queen Mary or the Queen Elizabeth rather than the university library, and thought the swimming pool should be down the bottom. Instead, in fact, what you find, you get this well, which of course does give a great feeling of spaciousness. But the two things that were not realized at the time, if you look at the librarian's desk on the left, you will notice that there is a little canopy which is being suspended over them. That was for one simple reason, that it appealed to the rather sadistic side of students, that it was a very suitable point to be able to drop things over the top, right onto the librarians beneath. Furthermore, the whole idea of having a well running through the building was that the noise went through that building like anything, and it just was, it's just terribly unsuccessful. So beware of the great wells in heavily used libraries, because they do cause problems, even with carpet and acoustic treatment of ceilings. A slightly different library just happened. I'm just showing the kind of thing which I discovered when I went investigating. You know, in an old Quonset hut, or what you would call a Quonset hut, somebody has just got a few pieces of wood, knocked them together, and made themselves a little study library. It's a little kind of departmental thing for a few hundred books, but that is a library. Going round looking at a school in actually a building which had been condemned in the north of England, but the most marvellous thing, it was almost the best library I've ever seen. You know, the whole thing was full of activity, full of kids, and kids of what we would call underprivileged kids from poor families, really were making tremendous use of this space. They'd actually built it themselves with a master, and it to me epitomizes what a library should be, a place where there's a lot of activity and there's an obvious interest. And if you look there, everything's covered, the walls, the tables, the shelves, kids busy, and interesting. Well, I'm not going to go into what the kids were doing, but they really were doing quite a lot of interesting work, which was made easy for them by all the references that were around. Of course, English education now, I expect rather like American, is largely based on project work. An entirely different library. This is a county library. This is the kind of library which would administer a county in England with all the branch libraries, and this is the county of Bedfordshire, and it includes archives, and the archives happen to be on the top floor, hence the very narrow windows. And we're looking at the north facade of the building here, so unlike this building, the glass doesn't get the sun in and drive all of us out at midday. It is a nice building. It has, in fact, now I see it, except for the fact that it's concrete and with stone facing, it's rather similar to this building. Another library, a conversion. This is an old market hall in an old market town in Suffolk in England. It's the old market hall which was in danger of being pulled down because it was no longer needed as a market hall, and so the county architect and the county librarian got together and decided that it would make rather a magnificent little library for this small town. It's a town of only about 12,000 people, and so they have this rather magnificent building. And inside, of course, it makes quite a nice space. There's lovely little lots of kind of Victorian glass panelling on that window at the back, all the kind of detailing. Beautiful space. Don't like the fluorescent fittings hanging there, but still, can't have everything. And I'm now showing you one or two. I'm very interested in libraries as being for the community, and so you'll have to bear with me that I'm going to just show you one or two recent libraries in London, or in England, mostly London, and this is one in a suburb called Norwood, West Norwood, and it has to relate to that rather nice neoclassical church across the way, and we go in. Oh, I'll tell you something. Last night I showed the students a building which was used for the film Clockwork Orange. Well, this is the point will come in a moment. This is one of the facilities in what we would expect to find in a public library now, a kitchen which would serve food. In fact, this one has possibility of having a licensed bar. And it also has a meeting room, and this meeting room could be used for many purposes, and in fact was used in the film Clockwork Orange. And if anybody has seen the film Clockwork Orange, it's where, in fact, the young man was interrogated to see whether he'd been processed. And so they used this library as a site for that particular scene in the film. Now, in the library itself, well, what is a public library? Well, first of all, you've got to have a control point, and that is in the entrance of the library. And behind that, behind the wall on there, you get this little workroom with a very ingenious idea here of giving you work cabinets. And if you look on the wall behind, you will see all the work cabinets, which can then be lifted out and then put on this bracket on the side of the librarian's desk. You can see one to her right. And they contain various things. Each person has one, and they can be used for each subject, and they're just brought out as needed. And then it's the space itself. Well, just on the inside of the public entrance is the children's library, and it has this pit in the centre of the room here, lined and with rugs so that the kids can kind of lie down, sit down. And then the library itself is a very sympathetic space, just very simple, brick floors, and the timber ceilings, plenty of books. And then coming down the library, which is all round a quadrangle, it's all round, it's a one-story, basically a one-story building, round a quadrangle, which you can glimpse where the people are sitting, and we'll go down a little further, and you've got this young man sitting facing out into the quadrangle with the books on the right, and then going a little further down, quite rightly separating the professional advisors from the non-professional stampers of books. You see the people crowding round the advice desk. And then you go out into the courtyard, very pleasant little space. And you find the advisor's desk there with its catalogues and a small little exhibition area behind, a quick reference to the side of it again. And then you find the quick reference books just very near with a little writing service, and you see somebody there probably consulting a directory or a timetable catalogue on the left. And of course the other point about this advisor's position is that when you're sitting there you have a very good view of practically everything that's going on in the library, because you've got a quadrangle in front of you and you're looking down two sides of it, and you can see across right into the children's library on the other side. And then there we find again the quick reference there. And we're moving down the library now, round the corner, and we get our first, and in fact the only window, which looks out onto the street. So it gives the library an identity when you pass, but you're not disturbed by the very busy traffic in the street outside. And it's just when you turn the corner that you can glimpse outside, and you go closer. And you find then another small little exhibition area, and then in fact you can go up and look out the window and see that church we saw opposite, with a little window seat there. And this little area is for teenage people, and so it's kind of furnished slightly differently with a few local, well, even, I didn't know Humphrey Bogart was still an idol, but still somebody seems to think so. And it's a place where, rather like our library upstairs, your library, not our library, I haven't moved in yet. You have places for kids to relax, do their homework, like this. And in fact, a very pleasant space. And I think that is my idea of a very good library. Now this, believe it or not, is also a library. Also make a nice bit of abstract painting, of course, and it is in Denmark, and it's by the Danish architect Alvar Aalto. And it's in a sense it's similar to the last library, and that's why I compare it. It's for a No, I'm sorry, Arne Jacobsen, the Danish architect. I'm sorry. And it's designed for a suburb of Copenhagen, and it is also a library which turns its back on the outside. In fact, they've gone to the extent of building the walls of black marble. It's concrete block covered with black marble, and this is the view you have on. There is not a window facing outwards, but it is all round courtyards. In fact, the only thing you have out is kind of the chimneys and ventilation, which is that part. And then we go inside, and again we have our control point, and inside this very well equipped magazine section. Again, he uses clear story, and you can see, in fact, where the light is coming down on those magazine racks, lighting them from roof lights above. Quite nicely designed. Actually, it's like, I'm not sure whether my viewpoint, but in fact, first, let me see, I want to go check something. Well, yes. Point of criticism, of course. I think those top magazines are pretty high, and for the average person, because they have shelves sticking out, and so they'd be all right for me to reach, but not too good for most women. And you get these little courtyards here. You find a little study carrel there, and there's one of 4 courtyards, rather formal compared with the English example. Librarians, they put specialist librarians in amongst the various book stacks, as rather like the English example, except they put specialist librarians in specialist areas, although it's only quite a small branch library. And then put, I think, this kind of very sophisticated music library with these kind of rather nice chairs and all the brawn equipment strung across the back, and a Danish dolly to run the whole thing. And that rather nice shade of green as the surface. Very sophisticated Danish example, one which I'm sure our Dean would appreciate. I think actually there's just a few more, there's a few more slides. I must point out that I've taken out a lot of material because I'm trying to contain this lecture in a short time, and I'd just like to get a flavour of what kind of library buildings are being built in England. So I've cut out quite a lot of the historical part and just produced you several examples of libraries in England of slightly different kinds, and of course the Danish one and the German one. And this is one which is my favourite library, not because it's the best architecture, but it's just the right kind of place. It's for a little market town called Hitchin, about 25 miles north of London. It's a town which has a population, I suppose, of about 25 or 30,000, and it has a library which was contained in an old house which was given to the town, which you can see just in the middle of the picture. A rather nice 18th century house, which was the library and the museum, hopelessly inadequate for both because it was much too small, so they decided that they would just make the house into a little town museum and add a library, which you can see on the far left. And you see this kind of this very great problem of adding to an old building, in this case an 18th century building, and I think the solution of painting the original building white and having this rather dark kind of navy blue paint and this very simple architecture somehow has brought the two together. And I'm interested in why people like libraries. And I'm come to the conclusion it's the place, amongst other things, but most of all it's the people. And why I like this library more than anything is that marvellous lady in red who's the librarian, who simply bubbles with fun, full of unorthodox ideas, and really has done things in this library which are considered a bit taboo, and which somehow has made it a tremendously busy place. And she had one or two rather nice ideas, simple ideas, and I think the next one shows you one of them. She found some old millstones, and she got the architect to bring them along and just put them in the little courtyard there, and she put a piece of piping through it, and there you've got a little fountain, which of course you can't help but notice, and that also produces that lovely trickle which water does. And just a simple touch, but it kind of it humanises the library no end. And the use of informal spaces with little gardens, this one for magazines, you see the little garden beyond. One of the I think the most interesting sociological thing about this particular library is the way the books are arranged, and the type of book. If you notice, they are largely paperback, and they are put with their covers facing outwards. The idea being that most young people, and a lot of older people now, are used to buying things by flicking through. If you go and buy records now, you go and always flick through counters. And so the idea was that you would put books that way. Now, one of the interesting things about this, and I think, well, let me just come back to this point. We'll see that, in fact, if you've got young children, you have to have your book stacks put in the way that children can get at them, even if adults find it a little difficult. We've got a few users. Now this is the interesting point, and you're involved in the university world here, but there is in England what is known as the missing generation in libraries, and that is basically the teenager, and they are noticeable in most English libraries by their absence. And what is so extraordinary about this library is that they're noticeable there by their presence. And the whole secret, apparently, is the use of paperback books and the way in which the books are arranged. Now, one of the other interesting facts about this library is that it is a library in which all the classics are out, and this is a phenomenon. For instance, they told me that if you got Aldous Huxley, you had about 20 copies. If you had Dickens, you had about 20 copies as well. They were always out. And the funny thing was, they have them in hardback as well, and the hardbacks are always in. The paperbacks are always out. And it's the kids that are borrowing them, the kids who normally would never come into a library. And the other group that have suddenly taken to paperbacks are the old people. And so one finds this interesting phenomenon that the old people and the young people are using. I might add one other little thing. This librarian says, I'm quite happy that people will read. I'm not going to tell them what to read. And so you always so there are kind of what are known as cheap paperbacks right in amongst everything else. But the important thing is you can have your On the Fiddle on one side and you've got a bit of Kingsley Amis down below, but Aldous Huxley and Dickens go out faster than most of the other things. So in fact it's a very interesting library in that respect. And it is this curious thing that people like to finger through the books. It's very curious. I wasn't brought up that way, and I don't react quite the same way. In fact, I react against that kind of salesmanship. But it does show that a lot of people do it that way now. I want to know where my book is on the shelf and go towards it, not have to kind of go through a few covers. And just a couple of slides, kind of the user, and most of all the librarian. And I think a library must depend on the librarian for the way things go. And I think she's a lovely lady. I like her very much. And if ever I want to go and see a good library in action, I just go out to Hitchin and see this one. Well, it's kind of, in a sense, it's a very simple little journey, and I've just shown you a few examples, and I haven't been at all academic, I hope, and just to try and give you a feel of what's happening in the kind of library world in England at the moment. I'm not sure if it's what you came for, but maybe if you'd like to ask me questions, I'd be quite happy to discuss anything about libraries in England. I don't know if any of librarians have any point. Anything you would like to know about libraries in England? Well, in university libraries, let's talk about university libraries, because there are two schools of thought. I can tell you one university librarian who told me that 5% of my books are used by 95% of the students, and the other 95% of the books are used by 5% of the students, and that raises a tremendous problem. And the simple answer to that one is to have a great book stack and a basic collection of 5,000 books in a large reading room and study room, and you'll solve most of your problems. But is not quite whether that is educationally the best thing, I don't know. The other point of view is that you put all your books and readers together, and you plan your library rather like a department store with simple planning. And the 22'6" centre is the one I told you about, which is quite a great favourite in England. I could translate it metrically into 7.2 metres, which is what we would be working at in England at the moment, and this kind of simple floors will allow for many arrangements of books or readers. You can alter the arrangement, and I really feel that possibly the department store approach of several floors of just lots of space and a possibility of arranging things as you want them is a good one, and at each point of entry putting your advisor, so that you can, so it's rather, again, exactly like a department store. You put your most used departments on the first floor, and then going up in kind of descending order, so that you have your least popular at the top. And you would know more than I which those are. And then as you come out of your escalator or lift or elevator, you'd call it, or stairs, you would have advisors, and of course there would be stacks as well. But as far as possible now, as little stack as possible, because you see, the problem of new libraries in new universities, and I imagine you fit into this category, is are you all going to compete for the rare book stakes? There's more and more people chasing fewer and fewer rare books and costing more and more to do, or are you going to use the modern copies? in which case you're really not dealing with valuable books, expensive maybe, but not valuable. And therefore, what is the point of having great stacks? Let's put everything out in the open, or as much as possible. And therefore, maybe that's the way we should be approaching, and I think that's the way we feel that we should approach the new university library. Of course, I kind of started something in this particular building by saying I've discovered 2 books which I reckon are worth about $1,000 each in their library, and everyone's saying which, including the dean, and all the students are saying which ones. Well, of course, I'm not telling, but of course you can tell by the age of the book if that's any clue. I'm going to make the point which I made very strongly before at other lectures, that I've seen quite a lot of libraries, I've seen quite a lot of universities, and I've seen quite a lot of architectural schools, and I think that of those I visited, this is the best architectural library that I have come across, and I realised that there are arguments for and against having libraries in departments. We had, now in my own polytechnic, we have had our library, or what was called a basic collection plus magazines in our own department, and the librarians have been kind of pulling harder and harder, and gradually, well, I'm not sure whether they pulled us, but in fact what has turned out to be a very good compromise because of accommodation changes has worked out that we have a new library which is off the other side of our workroom. In other words, we have our main library and the workroom, and then off the other side of it is now the architect's library, which is fed directly into the general workroom, and then the architecture department spreads on from there. So in fact, we've got the best of both worlds. We've got our own library, but the library is directly connected to the main library. But I do feel that in this case, the great problem here in a department like this is whether the students will look at anything other than books on architecture. In other words, whether they go into the university library as a whole. But I think, well, here we are, we're training professionals, and I'd rather think that they would look at books on architecture than chance the fact that they might look at a few other books as well. And it's a risk worth taking of separating. And I'm quite convinced that if the education goes towards widening a student's knowledge, then he will widen his reading habits. And therefore, I'm on balance all for having my architectural students having books and magazines and everything else readily available, kind of 10 seconds away from where they're working, so to speak. Anyway, I've slightly digressed from your general question about university libraries to the particular one of this library and the relationship of sub-libraries. But I hope that gives you some idea of the way we are thinking. There are 2 ways, but I think generally taking the view that material should be made available as much as possible to the student in the open, and bearing in mind that most of us, I don't know about you, but most of people involved in new libraries, in new universities, are handling ordinary material rather than rare material. Let's get it out, let the kids get amongst it. And you never know what they might discover. Anything else you'd like to bring up? Yes? Well, I actually dashed in yesterday afternoon to the library to see if they had a score of a particular piece of music, which I unfortunately didn't have, but I somehow didn't expect to. And I happened to bump into what I think is the model of the new building. I was in a hurry, and so I didn't look at it, but when I'm not in a hurry, which should be tomorrow, I plan to have a look at it. Of course, I can see it under construction, and I can relate construction down here to the actual building there. But I don't know what kind of principles you're working on. Maybe when I go there, I'll ask somebody if they can explain it. Is there somebody who'd like to explain the new system, your new library to me? Because I'd be very interested to find out. Next time I come, presumably already. When are you expecting it to be finished? Oh, I see. I see. Well, of course, you seem to have a different problem that we were having, and that was that, and it led us to prefabricated construction, that we really had to get the students in quick. I mean, at one university in England, at York, the one where I showed you the library, funnily enough, the library at York is not prefabricated, and all the rest of the university is. We literally had to get from the thought of a new university to getting the first 1,000 students in under 2 years. So, and the university had to be really fully in occupation over a period of 5 years. And so the only way to do it was to build it with prefabricated. And so, of course, one is used to now getting buildings built very fast. And that seems to be a long, long time to me. Summer of 1975?
Yes, because it was very time, but we can't move in and
Oh, I see. You've got to wait until that long break. Yes. Well, let me say to you then, hopefully you'll get the builders to have it ready ahead of time. You may win. In other words, don't let them say, well, you don't need it until summer. They've got to be pushed, because the one thing about new buildings is give them time to breathe, and therefore don't kind of move. Don't get in the position where you're moving in as the kind of cement's just been poured. But give the time building to settle, the faults to emerge, and emerge they will. The what? Well, of course, architects never do follow the proper advice. Well, of course, you realise that architects are very perverse people. I mean, they're quite good at giving other people advice and then doing just the opposite thing themselves. But well, there's no harm in. Well, no harm in pointing out that if you do have time, give time for the building to go, and it makes that kind of move so much easier. You can kind of see the position, you can see the space. Well, there's a world of difference between seeing a plan and even seeing a model, and then begin to see the space, and you'll find it's very different. Well, that's marvellous. Keep them at it, because those builders will say, you're not moving in until June. Oh, well, of course, then you don't need the building until a week or two beforehand. You don't let them get away with it. Anyway, I hope I've given you a very kind of, it's really, I must admit, a kind of rather sketchy survey. You see, the whole point was that I brought material here. I should explain. I had a kind of long telephone conversation across the Atlantic with Dean Sappenfield, about 3 days before Christmas, I think, when everything was kind of at last decided that I could come, or I'm here as a tourist, you see, and brings the material for lectures. And so in fact I have something in the region of 700 or 800 slides of libraries, and the type of library I tended to bring was the kind of public library which students might find. I would, in my own case, in my own school, students tend to be involved with designing public libraries, and therefore that's why I brought kind of slides of mainly of public libraries, so that they can show them how we approach them. But I hope anyway that it gave you a flavour of a few libraries and a few important libraries, even if the emphasis was on the public library. Anyway, thank you.